Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of today at the Eurasian Media Forum. And what better way to wrap up the discussion than with our environment topic and a session entitled Green Strategy, Another Last Chance. And moderating this session, having come over from his base in Belgium, is the Editor-in-Chief of the EU Observer. Please give a warm welcome to Kurt de Boeuf.
Thank you very much. And it's to attend this panel on Green Strategy, Another Last Chance. And it is my honor in the first place to introduce our panelists who are from an extraordinarily diverse background and who will tackle the issue we are going to discuss today from many different angles. Let me first ask to come to the stage Mr. Timur Jantikin, who is the CEO of the Kazakhstan nuclear power plants. He is advisor to the International Atomic Agency's Director General on Technical Cooperation, Nuclear Security, and Mr. Timur, I will use the first names, it's going to be easier, is from Kazakhstan. Please have a seat. Secondly, I would like to introduce Matthew Pai, who is Head of Philosophy at the European School Brussels II. There are 4 European schools, that's why 2. And he's founder of the Climate Academy and an author of a book called Plato Tackles Climate Change. He lives in Belgium. Thirdly, I would like to introduce Nazanin Alikia. She's a humanitarian, philanthropist, human rights activist, and education ambassador. And she's joining us, I believe, from the UK, or is it rather Qatar? UK, okay, welcome very much. And then we have Irina Zhukova, who is Regional Director Sustainability for Russia and Eastern Europe, for Philip Morris International, and she's joining us online from Russia. There are 2 other panelists who are trying to connect and be with us very soon. Let me just introduce them for the moment that they will join us indeed, which is Kadu Sibunya, who is Chief Executive Officer of the African Wildlife Foundation, and he will join us from Kenya, and also Joe Ruxton, who is the founder of Ocean Generation, formerly known as Plastics Ocean, from the UK, and hopefully he will be able to join us soon online from the UK as well. So our panel, again, is a vast subject. What is the green strategy? Can we preserve what we have? And can we preserve indeed our nature and give it through the next generations? I must say that this summer, again, was the warmest summer ever recorded. And when I was driving this summer from Belgium to France, I saw floods in Belgium, in Germany, while at the same time there were wildfires and record heat waves, not just in France, but also in North America, Southern Europe, Russia. There were typhoons going on several continents in this earth. And you ask the question when you see all of that, how can this continue? How can this go forward? And certainly, of course, what needs to be done? Let me ask you a first question, which is, from each point of view that you are working and thinking and trying to be an activist in some ways, is what is the worst case scenario from your field? I mean, how do you think if right now nothing is done, what would the world, from your perspective, look like in the years or decades to come? You can go to 2030 or 2050 as you like. And let me start perhaps here in live with Mr. Timur from Kazakhstan, who is a specialist in nuclear power. And I mean, what is the worst case scenario, I mean, from your perspective? How do you see things evolve if we don't do anything? Please, Timur, you have the floor.
Thank you. I work in the power sector, and energy sector or power sector is the backbone for industrial development, and it's the backbone for, I would say, development of our civilization. And the humanity, as it was developing its technologies, was using different energy sources. And I work in the nuclear power sector, and I think that now time has come to start thinking about reducing the footprint of the energy sector, of the power sector. If we do nothing today, if we continue using old technology, we will deplete old resources, the resources that could have been used otherwise. This could be used as petrochemical resources and so on. Otherwise, we'll just burn them. So we need to move to new energy sources. And I think that by 2040, 2050, the humanity should be able to master the technologies, renewable energy sources, or maybe other energy sources such as nuclear energy, and hopefully they will leave a smaller footprint on the environment, on our health and our lives. If we do nothing, we'll see a destruction, we'll see depletion of resources, and we'll see elimination, or rather violation of ecosystems. And we need to act now to switch to new energy sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allow me to ask you a follow-up question. Not so very long time ago, we have seen, of course, the Fukushima nuclear plant, create a massive devastation in Japan and far beyond, and the seas and so forth. How big is the chance that we can see or will see another nuclear disaster? You as a nuclear specialist, how dangerous is it to keep on going with nuclear energy, in your opinion?
Well, we certainly try to increase the safety of these technologies, and the disaster that happened in Fukushima, before that, that was the Chernobyl, before that there was a 3 Mile Island, and experts looked into these accidents, and basically people know about it because this information was not hidden, was not classified. They were trying to resolve the issues, and these studies led to improvement in the safety of modern reactors. Right now, the estimate is 10 to the power of -7. That is the probability of an accident with the release of these pollutants into the environment. So it means that if this reactor will be in operation in 10 million years, there is a chance that there will be one such large-scale accident in 10 million years. Of course, with the current life of the reactors, which is 60 years approximately, with possible extension, but never 10 million years. So the probability is quite low. And these types of probabilities can assure us of the safety of this technology. Certainly, we can never guarantee it 100%. Any technology, any installation always has some probability of a malfunction, but we need to minimize those probabilities. And nuclear energy, right now, I think, is probably the safest among the energy sources that are used for baseload.
Thank you. Let me move to Irina. What is, from your perspective, again, the worst-case scenario? What do you see happening if we don't do anything?
Thank you, colleagues. I would like, just give me a second, I have some problems. I can hear myself talking. Okay, let me try to continue. So I believe that any business right now understands that climate risks are among the key risks for doing business. But in our sector, we are working with many tobacco farmers who are located in many countries of the world, and certainly global warming will have an impact on their ability to grow tobacco, and that will lead to disruptions in supply chain. And to address this issue, and to address more serious climate issues, in 2000 2019, we have adopted a program document of, some companies call it statement of purpose. So basically our statement on what we are going to do and how we are going to do our business. So in addition to core business processes, we've also taken some commitments related to the environment. And certainly we have taken larger commitments, and I hope that I'll have an opportunity to talk later about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one question. So are you saying that if climate change continues the way it is and we don't preserve, the nature as it is, that maybe within, let's say, 10 or 15 years, people will not have anything to smoke anymore?
Well, you know, the smoking issue is quite challenging in itself, and that's not about smoking here, right? So if we talk about supply chains in general, so if I try to make the issue larger and look into supply chains in general, I think that any company, any business will face those climate risks because it will disrupt their supply chains.
Let me move to Nazanin from UK. I can't see her right now. Okay, hello.
Hi.
So I see that you're already working on this issue very intensively and for a very long time. So certainly you must work from a worst case scenario and how to try not to get there. So what is your vision if we don't do that?
So climate change is universal, but I think that it's very much subjective. So, if we're looking at different parts of the world right now, they are living their worst case scenarios. So I don't think it's a matter of what is going to happen. It's unraveling at a different rate. And if you look at, the Sahel region in Africa and Afghanistan, these places are really struggling with major issues now that is causing not just food insecurity. That food insecurity leads to, conflict. That conflict leads to migration. That migration. So it's happening. I don't think it's something of the future. I think we're living it right now. We're just living in a dichotomy in different worlds to be able to really feel and understand. And it's only when it hits us as a major natural disaster and as an event that it really does affect us. But for some people, this is their day-to-day reality at the moment.
Can you give us one example or elaborate? You said in the Sahara or in Afghanistan. Can you give us one more concrete example where you say, this is, a terrible thing that is happening right now. People have to move. There's no water, or there's too much water. So, what is for you the case that you say? Look at that, and then you understand all what we need to do.
Perfect example is Afghanistan. If we take Afghanistan right now, is going through a major drought to the extent that it's cut their food production down by 40%. That is food insecurity. And what does that lead to? That leads to migration, that leads to inequality, that leads to digression. There's certain parts of the world, if you look, we have really unraveled a lot of the socioeconomic gains that we've made. And Afghanistan right now is a living example for that. And I don't think in places like the UK and the US and we haven't really felt the impact of it as of yet, but I think the pandemic taught us that our problems are not, in isolation to one another. They're shared problems. So I think in time we're going to see the effect that has on our communities.
Okay, thank you. Let's go first to Matthew Pye, actually. So, what is your nightmare dream about what is going to happen?
Yeah, so in agreement with Nazin, I think the worst case scenario is happening now. I don't see how it can get worse for a Pacific nation. But if we talk about looking decades into the future, well, we seem to be on an unwavering path towards 3 to 4 degree warming. And that sounds like an abstract problem, but if we put that into a metaphor of the human body, if I had a temperature of 2 degrees, I would be struggling to think clearly now and be on this stage. And if I had a temperature of 4 degrees, medicine calls that hyperpyrexia, and that'd be just 1 day, 1 hour or 2 away from death. So if we have a planet that's on track towards 4 degrees, this is a problem which will, in the end, be universal, and these issues like the German floods and all these particular issues will affect everybody systemically. Now, I think as a philosopher, we have always to be attentive to data, and so therefore to kind of just to ground all of this, we're in a situation now where the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are at 413, and that's not just a historic level, that's a profoundly historic level. The greenhouse gases have wavered in a stable equilibrium between 180 and 300 parts per million, and we just shunted them into a completely different gear. So if you're dealing with a planetary system with all kinds of chaotic forces, who knows how it's going to play out, but it won't look funny. So I think you can see already some of these things. We have a warming at the moment of 1.2 degrees, we're already at 1.2. And if you just think of the 3 basic elements of being a human being, food, water, shelter, sea level rises in the Mekong River, that's causing terrible problems of salination for rice. Water, the Himalayas, the projections on the glaciers are absolutely terrible, and over 2 billion people will suffer from that. And then just shelter, if you think of California and these parts, huge tracts of land will just become uninsurable. So we're right in the middle of something which is unfolding in an absolutely terrible pathway, and underneath it all, just to finish, our emissions are still accelerating.
Thank you. I mean, some would say that, if you look into history, that we have periods when the Earth was cooling down, the ice ages and so forth, and periods when the Earth was warming up. And there have been periods in the past that perhaps was less dramatic. What do you say to these people who are saying this?
Well, there are natural cycles in nature, the Milankovitch cycles, that depend on the tilt and the wobble of the Earth and so on. But you have to ask geologists, you can ask them about that. But like I said, if you look at the territory that we're in now, has not been seen in the readings of ice core data or anything for 4 million years. So that is very unprecedented. So yes, there are always oscillations in the climate, but this is not an oscillation. This is a shunt, and this is a very dramatic shunt. And we're in completely unknown territory. And there's no way you can account for this. Well, of course you can account for it. It's human beings and fossil fuels. It's not very difficult to work out.
Thank you. Joe, if I may come to you, we're just indeed asking ourselves what is the nightmare scenario, and you look from an ocean perspective already for many years. So what do you see happening, and what is for you, let's say, if we don't do anything, what is going to happen to our oceans? So enlighten us, please.
Yes, it's difficult actually to start with something so negative. There are, I would say, quite a few major problems with the oceans, and pollution is one of them, and an area I've been concentrating on for a very long time is plastic pollution, but also effluents and from industry and from agriculture going into the ocean. The sea level rising is another issue for coastal communities, but the climate change with more and more CO2 going into the ocean, then we're looking at ocean acidification. And that means that we're affecting the growth of corals, we're affecting any animal that develops a shell and anything with a bone, so that as the larvae are developing, if there's too much acid in the waters, they're going to find that very difficult to do. The other area that concerns me is coastal development. Certainly in places where there are mangroves. Mangroves are so important for sequestering carbon dioxide. I think we talk about the whole problem with climate change, but leave out the ocean as a solution. We need to protect mangroves, seagrass beds, salt marshes. These are so important for giving us oxygen, for absorbing CO2. And I think until the ocean becomes much more of a focus, we are going to continue to watch it decline. And then, of course, there's fisheries. There's overfishing, there's bycatch, there's illegal fishing. A lot of it is out of control. And that is something that we do need to get a handle on. It's not about profit, because if we continue like this, it's the fishermen themselves that will be as much of an endangered species as the fish.
Can you give one example that most people don't know that is already changing in our oceans and that has a, let's say, an effect that we don't think about, but that is going to be very important, or already is important right now?
I think with the ocean, it's not so much what we do know, because to me, the problem of ocean acidification is almost unbearable to think about. But the problem with the ocean is that we know so little about it. We know so little about the deep ocean. And if we're doing, for example, bottom trawling with massive nets being dragged across the bottom, not only are we destroying habitats and species that we've yet to discover that could have a whole host of solutions for us in medicine and in food and so many other things, but we are releasing carbon that has been stored there for millennia just by stirring it up and allowing it back into the water column. So we don't know the damage we're doing to the seabed. We don't know what's down there. Every time a sub goes down, they're discovering new species of fish. What concerns me is that we're going to destroy it before we even realize what we're losing.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me stay with you, I mean, for, let's say, another question, which is, I mean, you say we don't want to start so negative. So let us become a bit more concrete in a way, like what needs to be done from your perspective? I mean, we all know that, of course, that we are moving from the one COP to the other, from the one climate summit to the other,
yes,
trying to get the emissions down. But from your perspective, I mean, what needs to be done urgently?
I think the ocean has to be moved up the list of priorities. I think that has to be not only in COP and other massive global conferences, but in education too, because our children, and certainly my grandchildren, are still growing up thinking that the oxygen comes from the forests and that the forests absorb our CO2. The ocean provides much more than half of the oxygen we breathe, and is the biggest sequester of carbon dioxide that we have. And until we get those priorities right, we're always going to leave the ocean in the background. We're just going to think it's fine to keep throwing our rubbish in there, to take everything out of it, to mine all of the minerals and destroy everything in the process. I honestly think that if children grew up understanding that the ocean is our life support system, there would be a lot more respect for it. And that has to get into these big conferences. That has to get into the education system right from the start. And then all of us will be advocates. And there are so many solutions that come from the ocean, even simple things like health and well-being.
Okay, thank you. But one more question, and then I will go to Nazanin. I mean, how would you say to someone living in Kazakhstan, where there is no access to any ocean or real sea,
yes,
I mean, except for the Caspian, that an ocean is important? I mean, I assume
yes,
that most haven't even seen an ocean in their life.
It's a perfect example, And I say that the same thing to people who live in Alice Springs in Australia or in the Midwest America. Every second breath you take comes from the ocean. Without the ocean, you will not stay alive. It doesn't matter where you live or how far you live from the ocean. Without the ocean, every second breath you take, you would struggle for, because it's providing that oxygen. And it doesn't matter. I live right by the coast. I'm no different to anybody else who lives in the center of the largest continents.
Thank you very much. I think every second breath you take comes from the ocean is already, for me, the quote of this hour.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Nazanin, if I may. I mean, you were talking about, indeed, the Sahara, about Afghanistan, and other dramas already going right on. I mean, what is the highest point on your agenda? I mean, what should be done from your perspective as the first thing, let's say, in the years to come, or even in the months to come, as we have, of course, COP26 coming up in Belfast very soon?
I think we need to start to focus on building resilient communities. I think we really need to start focusing on weatherproofing our infrastructure, building more sustainably, not just thinking about our carbon footprint. Because, unfortunately, today we're still talking about climate change as if it's something of the future. And it's very much here, it's affecting every single one of us in different ways, some worse than other, but it is affecting us. And, as I said earlier, those catastrophic events have the potential to unravel a lot of things. So if we're building strong and we're building infrastructure that is waterproof, floodproof, fireproof, we don't have to take those steps back when we are faced with adversity. I think that the best way to go forward is to plan for now, take action now, and expect the worst. And also simultaneously focusing on how do we build for a more sustainable future? How do we change our practices? So I think the first thing to do, in my opinion, was to build resilient infrastructure.
But how would you do that? I mean, take, for example, Afghanistan that you mentioned yourself, or just take Tigray region where there's a famine going on in Ethiopia. I mean, how can you start, making these communities more resilient? I mean, I think many people have tried in the last decades or even longer, and they might say, like, it's not working. I mean, what are we doing wrong, or what should we do differently in the future?
Well, a lot of the problems that we're talking about stem from intersectional issues. So inequality, lack of access to education, lack of access to work, no livelihood. So, everything is quite interrelated. So when we're thinking about investment, if we're investing in, for example, something that I personally focus on a lot, women and girls, ensuring we have an equal society. That way we have more opinion, more voices at the table, more experience, inequality, education, and just diversifying the workplace. So I think if we look at the root of the problems as opposed to thinking where do I even start now, just addressing those one by one, then we can look at, okay, well, we're addressing that. How can we utilize new technologies to build better infrastructure? There are companies today, there's one that is building recycled material from recycled plastics. So they're utilizing recycled waste. They build bricks, and they build infrastructure that is fireproof, earthquake-proof, water. And these are the kind of things that, as investors, as philanthropists, we need to start focusing on.
Okay, thank you. Let me get to Timur. You were already talking about the need to the shift to green energy, but we have to say it's going very slowly. So, in some countries it's going very fast, and others it's going very slowly. I think, for example, here in Kazakhstan there might be many more opportunities to, for example, wind energy, solar energy. And what should be done to step up our pace? Because on the pace at which it's going right now, we're not going to get there on time. So what do you think should happen right now?
I think that we, of course, need to resolve the green energy problem in complex. When I say complex, it means not only studying wind generators and other alternative types of energy, but other things. For example, currently mankind are designing and building up electric-driven vehicles, and it consumes energy. All of it concerns energy. So how much energy are we spending to produce one vehicle of the kind? And the second problem is the stable, sustained provision of population with electric and heat. Sustained development stands for sustained energy. Of course, there are opportunities and options for alternative energy, solar plants, wind energy plants, but at the same time, let's not forget about the conventional energy facilities. We just have to calculate accurately how much, in addition to traditional energy facilities of wind and other types of alternative sources of energy, we can install. We have this mission in front of us. The government instructed us to do so. By 2050, we are supposed to transfer 50% of our energy to alternative sources, hydrocarbons-free resources. More than a half of our future power plants are supposed to be driven not by coal and not by oil and gas. I work in the nuclear company, that's why I always praise atomic energy. And at the same time, we must pay due attention to wind generation technology and think about how to improve the effectivity of solar electricity plants. So I think the task standing in front of us, the deadline 2060, the objective to minimize the hydrocarbon trail is quite achievable. This is what constitutes the principles of sustained development of the Kazakh modern society.
Let me ask you this question. I mean, in Belgium, where I'm from, I mean, the discussion is right now, if we can get to these goals, to these climate goals in 2050 or 2060, if we stop nuclear energy. So this debate is actually going on at the same time. I mean, we should stop this nuclear plants, we should close them. But at the same time, if we do so, we'll probably always be incapable of reaching the other goals, the climate goals that we have been promised to do. So is it possible, I mean, you can talk about Kazakhstan, but also, let's say, perhaps on a world scale, worldwide, is it possible to do both things? Stop nuclear energy and at the same time reach the climate goals that without oil, I mean, and carbon, coal, excuse me.
Well, I think that without nuclear energy, we shall not achieve alternative goals because the output of solar and wind facilities is not that high, and if to talk honestly, the cost value is not that cheap. Second thing is the base energy, the conventional energy. It must be generated from stable, sustained sources. Unfortunately, alternative energy is not stable. It has a lot of problems with the integration with the conventional energy system. There is nothing terrifying about that. This is a matter of big discussions. We see a lot of discussions ongoing in the European Union, by the way, whether to include or not to include nuclear energy into green energy. Russia has included. European Union are still in process of discussing all pros and contras. But my personal opinion is that without nuclear, we shall not achieve the green energy because the time lapse is pretty short until 2050.
Let me go to Irina. I mean, you were talking about supply chains and the danger of disruption of supply chains in your worst case scenario, actually. So from your point of view, I mean, what is highest on the agenda, or what should be higher on the agenda and should be tackled in the years to come?
Let us, colleagues, let me tell a little bit how we view on the problem as business people. As I've said, to us it is of utmost importance to have environmental agenda integrated into our business mission. We are adherent to the Paris climate bargain. We have seriously reconsidered our mission, target and goals. We've made them more ambitious. We have several scopes of activity. That is the reduction of emissions. And if to take a look globally, We operate in more than 180 countries, and last year we have reduced our emissions compared to 19 by 18%. Our final goal is total neutrality, and we want to achieve it by 2030. We already have 2 factories. In total, we have 39 factories. 2 of them are now totally green and operating in the new pilot regime. For us, it is of utmost importance to fulfill all green agenda items. For example, such a thing as corporate vehicles. We have a lot of vehicles, and we want to eventually substitute those vehicles with electrically driven cars. Waste cycling and management is another big problem of ours. We have a representative office in Kazakhstan, and that company today are conducting very active enlightenment activity among local Kazakh population about the proper recycling, the proper division of waste by types. So these are the initiatives we have for Kazakhstan. And our company are paying quite serious attention, not only to the enlightenment projects, but to some specific volunteering projects. This is when we parachute our people out in the streets where they take part in various public activities, such as streets cleaning, etc., etc. In Kazakhstan, almost 90% of our wastes are being recycled today. So we have touched upon the smoking issue a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about smoking. Currently, the company is under serious transformation. We want to sooner or later introduce new products that offer reduced risks for smokers, and we want to abandon some of traditional means of smoking. The new devices, this is what I imply. So in the past, our company had nothing to do with electronics. Today, because of our new devices, new gadgets, we are actively penetrating the electronic market. And we have a new program for the reutilization of the used devices, and that program is currently being tested in various countries. When we work with our providers and vendors, we are also applying the new procurement and logistic principles that must be compliant to the principles of sustained development and green economics. This is of utmost importance to us. All those innovations that help us to save on water, save on electric light, save on other resources, they are to the benefit of the company, and the money saved from that may be redirected into green economy. And ourselves as human beings, as a corporate entity, as a corporate citizen, we pay very serious attention to what we are discussing here now. Take it from me.
Well, thank you for an overview of what actually a very important multinational is doing, also trying to do. And in the view of many people, I mean, I think that they see, well, multinationals as the main, well, culprit, the main, they're doing the most harm to the environment. If you look at not just your company, because you have been explained, but do your colleagues, I mean, other, let's say, big firms, do you see an equal amount of effort being done to really, well, improve, let's say, or decrease the footprint of the company on nature in general?
Well, it's pretty much complicated for me to talk on behalf of other companies, because it's not quite righteous to evaluate the other corporate entities. But to my mind, at present, the sustained development agenda makes it necessary, makes it an absolute necessity. And it looks like this is the only way for a big business to survive under new reality. Today we are seeing a lot of active discussions in the Russian Federation, and I'm more than sure that in Kazakhstan you are also discussing those affairs, mobilizing all concerned parties, particularly regulatory bodies, civil society. Of course, big corporations are under big pressure today. And today we know that younger generation are well aware about the environmental attitudes, about the environmental agenda, and this is what they're expecting from the big business. Of course, this is not a simple task. This is not a simple history, but to my mind, this is the only option for the big business to survive in the new reality. We must transform, we must walk towards sustained development.
Thank you. Matthew, I mean, you already touched upon like what needs to be done. I mean, made the question a bit more concrete. So you said, I mean, if you have 1.5 degrees more as a temperature of your body, I mean, you start feeling very badly. And if it's more, I mean, you can't think properly anymore. So I mean, you're talking about global warming, obviously, and about what should be done, but let's make it as concrete as possible. So in your opinion, I mean, what is the most urgent thing, perhaps concrete thing, that we should do in the years to come?
Yeah, I'm going to be modest and say it's not my opinion first. 1.5 degrees, as you say, is not comfortable, and we know that there's a budget for that, a carbon budget, and that's known by science, and it's known very clearly, and that's 233 gigatons. So we can still emit another 233 gigatons into the atmosphere and have a good chance of staying at 1.5. So that is what it all comes down to. I mean, there's all these different angles and perspectives, different initiatives, but at the end of the day, that's the budget. And I think that, when you ask, what's the concrete solution? Well, it's not more complicated than that. Now, there are two, in terms of how do we achieve that, I think there are two major things to say. And the first is with media, and the second is with governments. If you think about media coverage of climate, it's extremely pervasive. And we have, all sorts of climate, especially after Greta, there's a big surge in climate coverage. But there is no coverage of a climate index. We don't have a carbon budget index. And by its emission, that's a really freaky fact. When you open The Economist, you have all the gold, all the oil prices, all the inflation rates, all the GDP rates, but we don't have a handle on that carbon budget. You go to COP. I was in COP 25 in Madrid. At no point is the carbon budget addressed or central to media coverage of anything. So nothing is ever measured according to just the hard truths of what it all adds up to. And I think that here we have many major media companies. That is something that I think they have to step up to. Now you say, well, I've lied a little bit in that there is actually an index. And this index has been worked out by the climate scientists that I work with, Birgit van Munster and Michael Wadley, and they're in close collaboration with the world's most eminent scientists. You can go on the website, Could 11%, and this website takes that index and it gives every single nation of the world what their fair responsibility is for that global 233 gigatons that are remaining. And if I just break that down a little bit, if you think that every year we emit 42 gigatons into the atmosphere, and if there are 233 left, that means we have 6 years before 1.5. Now, but when you match that with, as you mentioned before, Europe's targets for 2050 or targets for 2060 or whatever, those timescales are way off. And so in some ways we just need a reality check, and that's not happened. The media currently is not holding governments or corporations or anybody to account. So this carbon index should be out there. And in terms of our country, Belgium, if you look at the data for that, in order to stay under 2 degrees C, Belgium should cut its emissions by 14% per year, starting from today. That's for 2 degrees. And for 1.5, you can go and look it up on the website, because it's a shocking truth.
Right. Thank you. So we're discussing now already 1 hour. We have half an hour to go. So we had many perspectives. I mean, there's one question coming, but before I do, I would like to ask you one question that obviously everybody wants to know is like, I mean, you authored a book on Plato tackles climate change. Can you explain briefly what Plato has to do with climate change?
Yeah.
I mean, just very briefly.
That's a challenge, because Heidegger took 1 year to take the first sentence of Plato, so I'll be quicker than that. In the end, I conclude with the fact that individual actions are simply not enough. The type of scale of reform and infrastructure that's required can only happen through legislation. You need governments. Once you have the media making this number clear, then you need to have governments that can act on it, because all of our energy policies, everything is wired into the matrix of a legal system. And unless you set clear boundaries, if I just give one example, I heard Boris Johnson talk about the ambitious UK policy about climate change, but if I'm a teacher in a school, if we had an ambitious policy to reduce the number of poisonous pizzas in the canteen, I don't think ambitious is really a kind of a fitting adjective for that. So I think we have to get rid of the word ambitious and just, are we meeting the carbon budget or not? And so therefore, once you have the data in front of you, then you have a law to frame it. So laws simply, Messi can play wonderful football on a slightly smaller pitch, and it's the same. We need climate laws which bind nations to targets which are rooted in science and not rooted in general kind of waffly ambitions.
I think that's clearer than Plato himself, so thank you.
Well,
so one question from the audience. I would like to repeat that if you're sitting here, so please do not hesitate to raise your hand if you have a question. Also, people online, please put your questions online.
The first online question is, many young, frustrated activists like Greta Thunberg place alarming statistics in front of governments and claim nothing is addressed. It is all talk.
Can I go to Nazanin, please? I mean, you might share this frustration, or at least, I mean, you know what to do with it. Please, go ahead.
I mean, it's extremely frustrating because, as to the quote, yeah, she's absolutely right. We've seen her at all of the major events around climate change. We've seen her at the UN General Assembly. We've seen her at the World Economic Forum. And she has been ringing the alarm for quite some time. And the statistics that Matthew talks about, they're not unaware of this. The problem is the lack of political will. And unfortunately, we've seen the lack of cooperation, the lack of multilateral. This is a pandemic waiting to happen in its own. And until there is political will on all sides, until everybody comes together, the biggest polluters in the world are held accountable. The countries that are polluting the most are held accountable, not offsetting your carbon footprint, not sending your production over to China, actually changing the way you consume, changing the way your society consumes, advocating for more sustainability. I'm 100% with Matthew. Nothing is going to change unless these legislations are put in place. Right now we have, way too many companies lobbying and greenwashing their emissions and their polluters. And again, it's a matter of accountability and legislation, as Matthew said. So I do agree with that quote.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, I think you can take quite a good example from Martin Luther King. You know, if we think about Greta Thunberg, she certainly brought many people onto the streets. But what did Martin Luther King fight for? He fought for laws, and he wasn't satisfied. He was kind of intolerant of slightly, you know, gestures towards a solution. He didn't stop until the Civil Rights Act was signed, because he knew that that was the thing, that was the matrix within which everything else would be sorted out. And I think that's what, now that the climate strikes are active, now that we have people on the street, now that awareness has been raised, we have to get to the next level. And the next level is a focused demand for science to guide policies. Otherwise, you're right, it can just feel like always saying the same thing, always, you know, cut emissions, cut emissions. You have to give it a focus now, and time is short.
Joe, I mean, can you add something from your perspective?
Yes, I'm totally nodding and agreeing with everything that's being said, and Matthew has set things out very well about explaining in such a simple way the problem we've got and emphasizing it. I think one of the problems, and I can't speak for you know, governments around the world, but certainly looking at ours, I'm in the UK, is that the politicians are in place for such a short time. So they have a very short focus, much of which is on their own careers and their own retirement. So they will do things that will see them through for that length of time, and then after that doesn't seem to matter. So we need to look at, you know, beyond a 4-year period when people have been voted into power. And the other thing is there is no expertise. The person in charge of the environment might have been the education secretary before that, the foreign secretary before that. There's no expertise and qualified people leading the departments that they've been put in charge of. And that, I think, is, it shouldn't be up to the green groups, it shouldn't be up to the filmmakers and the people on the street to have to tell them what to do. If they were qualified in it, they would know. And I don't know how to change that. And then, of course, greenwashing is another massive issue, and certainly one that we've seen with plastics, because they're seeing incineration as a way to dispose of it, which couldn't be more wrong. Or people think recycling's the answer, and recycling isn't recycling, it's downcycling, and most of the time it only happens once. So all of these things that they hide behind as solutions don't convince me and shouldn't convince people when they're not true, and it's just too easy to greenwash and too easy to plan for their own retirement, is my summary.
Thank you. I believe there's another question.
Yes, another online question. What would be the worst scenario for humanity if we do not take action?
Matthew feels...
Well, I think the worst case scenario, like the really worst case, of course, is that you end up pushing the climate into these tipping points. And yeah, I don't think I would ever read a bedtime story to a child where we describe what 6 degrees looks like. But we may, if we allow ourselves to go over 1.5 and 2 degrees, then we're entering to that minefield, and that's the ultimate. I mean, that's completely inhospitable to humankind. So, yeah.
We have a question from a lady here in the public.
I would like to ask the following question. It's a topic of the Aral Sea and the Balkhash Lake here in Kazakhstan. The Aral Sea is called an environmental catastrophe in Central Asia. This used to be the 4th biggest lake in the world, and lately, people are starting to say that the local Balkhash Lake is following the path of the Aral Sea, and that could lead to reduction in the fresh water available to people. Many people are now talking about it in the media. However, I don't see any actions by the state or any recommendations on how to stop this process of the drying up. What could we do? Any recommendations, any ideas? What can be done with this issue?
I believe, Timur, that she was watching your direction. I'm not sure if you can answer the question, but was it for you? Oh, I give Timur the floor, please, yeah.
Well, I'm not a hydrology expert, of course, but indeed, the problem of the Balkhash Lake is the problem of the inflow into the lake from the rivers. As far as I understand right now, the biggest issue lies in the transboundary rivers. If the governments don't agree on the water use, the use of the water from a certain river basin, then we might face the same situation as with the Aral Sea. We also see that there is a fluctuation in the sea level on the Caspian Sea. It's this problem of these lakes. This might be also related to climate change. Maybe it's the question of evaporation being greater than the inflow of water. I guess it's up to the specialists. They need to join efforts. And it's not only about Kazakhstan, but it's also about cooperation with the neighboring states. They need to regulate the issue of water use somehow, water inflow.
Anyone else who knows something about the Aral Sea? I've been flying over it, and you can see that both the rivers who are normally feeding the sea are actually dried up, or the water is used for different things. So when the rivers are going to the sea, then there's actually nothing there anymore. But Matthew has perhaps another opinion.
No. I think in some ways these examples are good to hold, to help us imagine climate change. We should stare at that and think through that this is going to play out across all sea levels and everything. I mean, if you just go back 16,000 years, we built our whole civilization on the sea levels that we inherited from there. But there's 80 meters of sea level that can still happen. And that's kind of an unimaginable thing. So I think if we in a way meditate on things like the Aral Sea, it helps us focus the mind to think, yeah, things can be different. The status quo, it's not fixed.
I'm not sure, Joe, if you have it's not an ocean, of course, it's the Aral Sea. Do you have any knowledge about that, or?
Not specifically, no, but I think we all need to expand our own horizons. When you're walking beside a river, if somebody, for example, chucks a cigarette butt into the river, I think they need to think about the fate of that. All rivers will lead to the ocean or drain into big lakes. What is going to happen to that in the end? We're very inwardly focused. We don't think beyond our own years on this planet. And if you look at indigenous people, they think generations ahead. For example, in Hawaii, the first settlers there, everything they do, every action they take, they consider the effects 7 generations ahead. We just think about our own lives. We've become very selfish. But if we were to think of the actions that we're taking now, how is that going to affect 7 generations beyond ours? Is it going to cause problems for them? Is it going to mean that their world is going to be compromised? And if we could stop focusing inwardly, stop just thinking about ourselves and think about the generations to come, think about how this is going to affect other people, then maybe we'd be better people and we'd have a better planet. When I think of recycling here, all going off to China, and China finally said, no, we don't want it, because they never really did. They only wanted some of it. So what do? Instead of recognizing it as a problem, we'll send it to Malaysia, we'll send it to Poland, we'll send it to Turkey. It's always, as long as we don't have to think about it, we have to start taking responsibility. And we have to start taking responsibility for other nations and the planet that can be affected by our own actions. That was a very long way going from rivers into the lakes, but it does all matter. We are all connected.
When you talk about rivers and about, the Aral Sea, I have to think of Genghis Khan and his army. Actually, within the Mongol armies, when you threw something in a river, you got death penalty immediately. So it was the most sacred thing. Don't touch the rivers. I'm not saying we have to reintroduce it, but just to say that taking care of rivers is not something that is brand new.
No.
There's some other question, but before this, of course, we started with, let's say, with dramatic scenarios. And you can feel a little bit of frustration. Going around. Can I do an effort in order to turn this around, also for the listeners, and so that they're not going to quit the session just in depression, actually? And it is that every single one of you, actually has been fighting has done something to improve, I mean, the situation, to improve, be it the oceans, be it wildlife. Unfortunately, Kadu cannot be with us, but I would like to hear some personal story here. Like, you have been fighting this for so long. What have you done, and what is possible to do from a personal perspective? And I think that might cheer up or inspire, I think, all the people listening to you, and there are a few hundreds. And let me perhaps start with Timur. I mean, because your case, of course, it might sound technical, but it is so important. So can you, in a few minutes, say, what are you doing? What are you trying to do? And perhaps where have you been successful? I think that might be a good story to hear.
It's a challenging question. All right. So first of all, I also wanted to do a small follow-up on this water problem. I think that we have two problems at the same time. It's the glaciers melting. You know that right now the glaciers are melting, and that is another issue that might be partially related to the energy sector, because you know, some of the pollutants that we have in the energy sector, some dust or ash might be collecting in the mountains, in the glaciers, and that also leads to greater melting. Well, speaking about my experience, about my case, of course, I've worked in the nuclear sector, and I truly believe that the nuclear power will harm the environment less, and I try to promote this idea in Kazakhstan, especially since Kazakhstan has some experience with a nuclear power plant which was actually shut down in 1991. So that is probably my biggest contribution. I believe that although this is a small contribution, it's still a contribution to reducing the footprint on the environment coming from the power sector.
Okay, thank you. Nazanin, when I hear you talking, I feel the passion and also the anger sometimes. I mean, what do you do, I mean, in order to change concretely? And if you have any success, it would be great to hear that. I mean, you can be as concrete as possible.
Yeah, so one of the interesting projects that I'm working on this year and is pertinent to the region, I partnered with UNICEF Kazakhstan to launch a program for a group of 20 girls that are that go through a curriculum based on building nanosatellites. And these nanosatellites are then sent into space and into the atmosphere, where they measure air quality and detect different sort of mineral resources. And going back to the point that I made earlier on addressing the root of the problem. So simultaneously looking at technology and how technology can help propel us forward, but also incorporating a model where there's inclusivity, diversity, there's more women, you're empowering women, you're encouraging more people to get into STEM education. So things like this where you're really touching the fundamental root of the problem, as opposed to just saying, well, let's figure out how we can utilize it. We have to incorporate everything together. It's going to take serious mobilization and serious commitment to all of the goals that we have in terms of equality. So that's one of them. Another one which I mentioned was the plastic brick project, which we're planning on launching in Africa. You know, utilizing plastic waste to build these classrooms, because again, you know, there's all our different ways at which we're dealing with these problems with plastic pollution, and certain parts of the world, instead of fighting it, we incorporate a solution that gives the community a way of being able to actually make a profit on the problem, as opposed to drown in it.
Thank you. Let me go to Irina. I mean, you already gave quite an overview of what Philip Morris International is doing, but I think in order for our audience to grasp what one person probably also can do, even in a multinational, I think your story might be inspiring. So where are your successes? And I'm sure there are quite a few. So please promote your own work a bit.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. You know, I think that every person can make a contribution. That's true. And here in Russia, I'm also the head of the corporate volunteering council, which brings together about 100 companies. So we are talking about being proactive volunteers. And my colleagues in Kazakhstan are doing the same. And we are doing it as part of our own will. It's not about work. And we have so many employees in our companies. And many employees have these additional needs to contribute to the society. They want to participate in some environmental cleaning campaigns or other activities. But also, it's about raising awareness, and it's about explaining people why our actions are important. And often when we conduct this type of activities, we see whole families coming, and by raising awareness among them, we are creating dozens of ambassadors of these ideas, and they can spread these ideas through their families, between their friends. That's part of my personal contribution. But I think that every one of us can do a lot, actually not noticing it. It's when we are turning off the light, when we are stopping the water flow if we are not using it, just turning off the faucet. All of us can contribute to this issue. And you know, also one more thing. I wanted to mention a few words from the standpoint of the company. All these things that I've told before can be also confirmed by international rankings. We are among the few companies that have this AAA ranking, so the highest rankings in terms of CDP and in terms of the way we treat the water use, the climate, and the use of forests. Not many companies can actually brag about this AAA status. So, thank you.
Thank you. Matthew, I mean, how do you change the world?
Yeah, I'm kind of used to being, in philosophy has a great tradition of making people feel uncomfortable, so if I've created a negative vibe, then I own it.
You're welcome.
But I can do inspiring as well. I think if you look at, just go back to Martin Luther King, and if you think about the situation during the Montgomery bus boycotts and etc., when Rosa Parks sat on the bus and refused to move, she said one thing in her head. She said, she just had the word Emmett Till. Emmett Till. So Emmett Till was the young boy who was brutally murdered in the Deep South. And by having an open coffin at his funeral, that triggered a whole... So sometimes negative things do actually cause inspirational shifts. And just 9 years later, the Civil Rights Act was signed. So society is shiftable, and you can have paradigm shifts quickly. So that, you know, we can be optimistic. If we're brave enough to look at it, that can sometimes trigger dramatic change. So more concretely, just for myself, I think that we have to get out of the paradigm of thinking about ourselves as simply consumers. So less meat, less this, less that. And we have to recognize that we're fuller people than that. We're social, we are civic, we have values, and if we could awaken that spirit, then you can see transformative change happening. And that's what I'm doing in my Climate Academy. The Climate Academy starts with knowledge, and then they move on to do civic engagement and social life.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you, what is the Climate Academy?
Okay. So, like Plato, you have an intense education. His was 50 years, but I have to be a bit more modest, so it's 2. And I house gifted and talented people in a school, in my school, and they go on to develop projects which have a big impact, both locally, but also with a global kind of universal reach as well, so that they can be like multiplied. So they have to think systemically from the beginning. And that's the shift that has to happen. We have to get away from just thinking of ourselves as consumers and getting to think of ourselves as like the full human being. I think we've had our imaginations cropped by the media and by politics. But the good thing is, like with Microsoft, when an image is cropped, you can click and just drag it, and you can restore the full image. So.
Yeah. Okay. Joe, I mean, what did you do? And we know what it's about, but concretely, I mean, how did you do that? And perhaps, I mean, where were your successes? I mean, yeah.
It's probably worth saying, I used to work for the BBC in the Natural History Unit and making underwater documentaries. And we were always showing the oceans as if they were in perfect condition and full of fish and full of life and that everything was fine. I had problems with that because as somebody who's been diving in the oceans for more than 3 decades, I had seen changes and I've witnessed the problems, but I could not get the BBC to cover environmental issues. They always said, people just want to be entertained. And I've always felt that people actually want to do the right thing. I think most people on this planet are good people, but a lot of the time they get overwhelmed by problems and don't know which direction to go in. I left the BBC because I wanted to make my own documentary about the truth of what was happening in our ocean. Those plastic, something tangible, and it's something that actually each of us can take a part in resolving. The very fact that we're making single-use items out of something that was designed to last forever, designed not to decompose, so designed to defy nature, and we're making things you can only use once and throw away. The minute you get that mindset, it's easy to change. My challenge was to make a film about plastic pollution interesting, because actually, if you think about it, it would bore me too. But once you storytell around it, you use charismatic characters to tell the story. For example, blue whales. You can bring people in, and then people are engaged with it, and people want to do the right thing. When I started, it was in 2009, and I've done a lot of school talks around the world. And the kids, it was all new information to them, and they soaked it up like sponges, and they became incredible ambassadors for the ocean. And they are their peers, their parents, their teachers into doing the right thing. When I go to schools now, these children already know. They are so informed and determined to do something. And they are the ones, I think, that are going to make us do the right thing. I always used to think we can't wait for them to grow up. We've got to get to the politicians now. The children are always already getting to the politicians. And I have so much hope for the future. And the changes I've seen in the way people are coming up with solutions and alternatives to single-use plastic items, and using plastic waste and valuing it and turning it into things like the house bricks, as was explained just now. There's so much we can do, and we have to stop bombarding people with negative information in the press and the media particularly, and start to give people hope, and start to give people knowledge, and start to give them the tools they need to write their lives. And that goes from everyone from the 3-year-olds right through the politicians, because underneath it all, everyone's good and everyone wants to do the right thing.
Thanks so much. I mean, in general, indeed, we started with the worst case scenario, and I hope that you realize how inspiring your personal stories actually are, and how that will motivate people, perhaps not to call them to become more ambitious, but at least to do something, because it's possible. I think we have 3 more minutes. Maybe there's one more question from the public.
So another question from online is, who do you think is more responsible for pollution, individual people or the government?
I can talk about...
Sorry, please go ahead.
Yes, I don't think we can point the fingers at any one person. I think we all need to look at our own plastic footprint, for example, or our own pollution footprint, because each person can make a difference, whether you're part of a corporation or not. If you're part of a corporation, you still have a voice, and there's something you can do. What we don't want to do is say, oh, it's that particular big corporation there, because that lets us off the hook, and none of us should be off the hook if we are part of the problem. And if we are part of the problem, we can be part of the solution. It's a jigsaw puzzle that needs to fit. And as long as all of us take responsibility, whatever level you are, whatever job you're doing, that's how we'll turn these things around.
Anyone else wants to add something?
And just to add on what Joe was just saying, I think the problem has been we've been finger pointing for too long. And I think that just has to stop. Every single one of us needs to take accountability and needs to do their part. So I'm completely in agreement with what Joe said.
There's one final question here from the floor.
I have a question to our foreign speakers. I would like to learn how things are like in their countries, because in our country, recently we've seen a struggle between environmental activists and businessmen who want to, for example, big hotels and develop their businesses in some beautiful natural sites, untouched natural sites. So environmental people are getting very uptight. Who do you think is righteous in this argument? Do you think any compromise is possible? And in your country, if you had at all these kind of situations, how did you resolve them?
Can someone take, let's say, the foreign perspective very briefly? Matthew?
I think again, the Green Deal, all these Green Deals, they have to be seen as positive. You know, all of the things that we're fighting for, all these infrastructure changes and everything, it's kind of an unfair dichotomy to say that, you know, well, this kind of negative climate agenda, it's a chance to regenerate, to restore wildlife, to have healthier lives. So I think there's not a conflict, and I think that in the case of particular countries, as long as we have that perspective, I think that will help synthesize these opposing forces.
Okay, let me conclude. So just with one single question for each one of you, and you just have to answer with a number. From 1 to 10, how optimistic are you if it comes to the world, well, beating climate change? So from 1 to 10, I'll start with Timur.
8.
Joe? From 1 to 10, how optimistic are you?
9.
9. Okay. Irina?
I think it is 10, and it is of utmost importance to act collectively. Today we have people representing various concerned parties, public associations, businesses, state officials. So if we work collectively and have a constructive dialogue, if we involve the government, the commercial sector into that constructive dialogue, I'm most certain it will be 10. I want to be optimistic.
A number from 1 to 10? One, two, three, four,
I don't know, but I'm going to say 9.9.
Okay, that's good. Matthew? Gonna say 10.
I'm gonna say 10 because it's.
So we ended with the cruelest disasters in the world facing climate change, and I think we ended with an overall optimism that it will happen and that we will preserve our nature and that we can give our children or grandchildren at least a bright future. Thank you so much, Timur. Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Nazanin. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Matthew, for this inspiring panel discussion. Thank you so much.
A very big thanks to Kurt and the panelists as well for that great discussion. I'm glad it ended so optimistically.